Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, perhaps the cheeriest message from city authorities this holiday season is that the number of murders has dropped dramatically in New Orleans. We'll examine what's up and why the numbers are down. We'll also investigate the status of Medicaid expansion in Louisiana, as well as David Vitter doing business with the Russians and corruption spreading to the suburbs. And we'll look at the political career of the late Chief Justice Pascal Caliguero. Our Future Watch segment looks at cruises with more boats on the way. On board for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Aboard, producer of Informed Sources. Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Mike Pearlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV. And we're going to go over to Mike first because we have seen a report recently. It looks like, the crime rate is kind of dropping for the city of New Orleans. New Orleans Parish, reduced murder rate, less shootings. That's really good news, but what's the cause for this?
Well, the police department attributes it to a variety of factors, one of which is this unit called Tiger Unit, which is Tactical Intelligence Gathering and Enforcement. They are a specialized unit. They are assigned to go after serial robbers, and they've expanded their mission to now include serial shooters, people who may be behind more than one shooting and or murder. And they are able to, with arrests, and they've had a pretty good track record of success in identifying perpetrators, making arrests, clearing multiple armed robberies, carjackings, and multiple shootings, and really targeting what would be considered the most dangerous criminals. There's also, and this is Police Chief Michael Harrison, giving credit to new technology, crime cameras now really blanketing the city, between the network of private cameras that are tied into the city network, as well as the city's crime cameras, which are popping up everywhere you see the red and blue lights flashing on utility poles. It's a little less clear to the public exactly how those are being used, but one, there's a deterrent effect, and two, they are able to at times get pretty clear high-definition images of perpetrators after crimes, rarely the crime itself, but if they run down a block where there are crime cameras that are able to capture images, they can then put that out. The media, we receive these all the time.
So is it helping solve crimes, would you say?
Well, the solve rate, unfortunately, is not as glowing. Those, whether it's murder, robbery, and other categories of crimes, including rape, are far below the national average solve rates. Those tend to have some lag time. Obviously, they'll be solving 2018 homicides well into 2019, we hope. So a little, I guess you might say the jury's still out on the solve time, whether that is keeping up with what is really a 6-month dip in the crime rate as far as shootings, killings, and robberies. Those numbers are relatively short term. It is yet to be seen whether that is really a part of a long-term trend. If you're a police officer, especially a New Orleans police officer, you're not talking about this at all. Just because cops are notoriously superstitious, they know that as soon as you start boasting about, a week without a homicide, then one will happen that night.
Right. Years past, it's always been, the murder rate's down, but the success rate of the doctors in the hospitals is up in terms of. Is the shooting rate actually down too?
The shooting rate
is way down. That is probably
or so.
even more important, simply because there are such small numbers on the homicide. You get a handful, we still have 9 days left in the year, and you get a handful between now and New Year's, and that, what is a double-digit percentage drop from last year, could dry up to single-digit percentage drop. The shootings, however, it used to be, once upon a time, back in 80s and 90s, the number of shootings to killings would be about 4 to 1, 5 to 1. Now it's about 1.5 to 1. Which really shows a very dramatic decrease in the shootings. Not sure, of all of the factors there, but so many things contribute to that, then until you see it sustained over multiple years, it's really hard to say that, this is the new safer normal for New Orleans.
But we are seeing an increase in car thefts and car burglaries. Is that
Quite dramatic, as a matter of fact. Just the way there's double-digit decrease on shootings and killings, there's double-digit increase in car thefts and car burglaries. We've all seen the videos of bands of usually teenagers,
Very young.
juveniles, in some cases as young as 10 to 12 years old, pulling on car door handles. Really, crime of opportunity, going for the easiest target. If you have left your car unlocked, then it's sort of on the car owner.
There are now signs all over town saying lock your doors.
The police department and city officials cannot remind people enough.
Right.
Just lock the car door. And some of those can lead to much more serious crimes. If you say keep a gun in your glove compartment or under your seat, that car gets broken into, and that could really lead to trouble later.
Now, Chief Harrison, apparently he was being courted by the city of Baltimore, but he said he's not interested in going anywhere. But is he being credited with some of this?
Well, certainly, as the top police chief, police officer in the city, he does take the credit. But he is, has gone about it in sort of a measured way. He is part of the police culture where they don't beat their chest over these short-term decreases just out of that long-standing superstition. He's very quick, however, to, embrace the new technology, give credit to that, and also understand this is a police department that is going about crime fighting in a very different way. Much of it because of the consent decree. Every officer is wearing a body camera.
There was that NOLA for Life program, the much touted
NOLA for
one.
Life.
Now it's called curb violence or cure violence to the
Latoya Cantrell's taken many of the same programs and just put it under a different name. But for the most part, these recruits have grown into officers just under the consent decree and are doing policing in what the mandate under the consent decree would be in a much more constitutional way, much more cognizant of the rights of any individuals,
Right.
that come into contact with police are handled much differently than just a decade ago.
Well, these numbers, though, do look pretty good, and maybe it is short term. We're going to hope that it's really setting a trend right now.
Right. If it goes
and
on
we
for,
wish them the best of luck.
if
with
it goes on for another 6 months into 2019, I think that even the criminologists who study these things in terms of long-term trends will start to think that something is going on here.
Okay, Mike, thanks a lot. I'm going to go over to Stephanie now. And there was a court ruling in Texas federal judge basically threw out Obamacare. So now people are wondering what comes next. And certainly a big issue is Medicaid expansion, which a lot of people jumped onto.
Right. Louisiana has been part of Medicaid expansion for 2.5 years now, a little more. John Bel Edwards obviously brought it in after Bobby Jindal refused to. Almost 500,000 Louisianans are on this program, and these are, for the most part, people who are working in jobs where they don't get health insurance or they don't make enough money to be on the regular Obamacare exchanges. And how this happened is a little interesting, that Obamacare was originally designed so that everybody would have access to some sort of subsidy if they needed it. But when the Supreme Court initially upheld the decision, they threw out part of it that required states to adopt Medicaid expansion. They said states had the option of doing it and some didn't. So that left a gap. If you're someone who's making up to 138% of poverty, you made too little to get a government subsidy. So that's kind of inherently unfair and doesn't make a lot of sense. Governor Edwards did expand Medicaid. More and more states are doing it, even conservative states. There have been referenda on a number. He's actually going to new Democratic governors and explaining how Louisiana did it. Louisiana is considered a model. And now it's all in question because of this lawsuit. Now, this lawsuit is not about Medicaid expansion. It had to do with the individual mandate, remember, which the mandate still exists, but the tax penalty, if you don't have health insurance, has been zeroed out by the Republican Congress as part of the tax bill. So Republican officials from 20 states filed this lawsuit. Jeff Landry, the Attorney General, is part of it. The Democratic Governor, John Bel Edwards, was very angry that he joined on behalf of Louisiana. So he's one of the plaintiffs, and it was filed in Texas. And the judge basically went further than anyone expected. Even the Trump administration didn't think Medicaid would be part of it. And they're pretty much supporting that lawsuit. But the judge wrote this very far-reaching opinion saying it's all invalidated because of what Congress did in the tax bill. It's going to be appealed. It will go through the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans. It will get to the Supreme Court, certainly. The problem is it's going to take some time for that to happen. So in the meantime, status quo, but we don't know about the future. So the legislature, one thing that does is that puts the burden on the legislature this spring to write some legislation in case it falls back to the states, even though it's probably unlikely to. And that includes protecting people with pre-existing conditions, a huge issue, getting people the essential benefits, what the law calls these services that are required, pregnancy coverage, mental health coverage, basic stuff. And then Medicaid expansion, at the very least, I think it'll be an issue in the governor's race. And because Governor John Bel Edwards, of course, is very much a supporter, the two Republicans running against him will really have to, I think, say whether they think it's a good idea, because it will be in flux in a way that it was not until now.
But meanwhile, though, status quo.
Meanwhile, status quo. The governor talked about it in his year-end press conference this week, and he said, don't overreact, don't panic. It's in flux. We're going to work on it. We're watching it. We don't know. It's going to take several years, but we feel pretty good that things will emerge okay. But it's going to be a tense couple of years. And it's all going to be politicized again.
So children up to age 26 can remain on their parents, because
For
that's another,
now, that's another hugely popular.
Part of Obamacare.
Yes, exactly.
All righty, Steph, thanks a lot. We're going to go
Yeah.
over to Errol now, and the passing this week of a longtime Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, Pascal Caligaro.
Yeah, by a long time, we mean 36 years.
On the court, yeah.
He served on the Supreme Court longer than anybody. He was first elected in 1972. He was Chief Justice for 18 of those 36 years. Now, in New Orleans, in Louisiana, Chief Justice is determined by seniority. So halfway through, he was already the senior person. And by all accounts, he was a very distinguished judge. He wrote over 1,000 majority opinions, had a good reputation for justice. He also did some things like worked on the Indigent Defender Program. It was also part of moving the Supreme Court building, or moving the location of the Supreme Court to the building in the French Quarter. The building we used to know as the Wildlife and Fisheries Building, which I think was a major addition that wasn't a touristy thing to have in the French Quarter. So I think he had a good career. I think something that's really interesting is the beginning of that career. He was a law partner as a young man with Moon Landrieu. And when Moon Landrieu was elected mayor in 1970, and like any mayor, mayors endorse candidates for different offices. But when there was a vacancy in the Supreme Court, Landrieu did more than endorse. He said, "We're going to win this one." And so he did an all-out campaign for Caligaro. And by this time, Landrieu, in winning the mayor's office, had formed a new coalition. The Voting Rights Act had passed, so there were more black voters on the voting rolls, and they had supported him strongly when he was elected mayor, something like 90%. And he had traditional moderate to liberal Democrats. And so Landrieu, as a young mayor and as a new mayor, had a fairly strong force behind him, and really turned that behind Caligaro. In that election, it was a classic Italian son of a policeman versus someone who was part of uptown nobility. And so it was kind of presented as that kind of campaign, and almost a class division sort of campaign. But because of the Landrieu forces, he was able to win, and then went on to have a very distinguished career.
Yeah, he was very respected, his law career certainly, and that he had a great impact on the state judiciary. And so we certainly do express our deepest condolences to the Caligaro family. Pascal Caligaro, like I said, on the Supreme Court for 36 years.
It's a long
That's
time
quite
to
a
do
record.
anything.
That really is.
And
All right.
decidedly progressive.
Right.
Those years were marked by all kinds of landmark decisions.
Absolutely.
And in what has become a solidly red state, he was firmly on the blue side.
All righty. Thanks a lot, E. and Mike, just now. And now we're going to go over to Don. And people are really enjoying being able to board a cruise ship here in New Orleans.
They are. New Orleans is the Port of New Orleans is on pace to make it the 5th straight year with more than 1 million cruise passengers coming through the city. And that's not just big news for the Port of New Orleans, it's big news for the city in general. 90% of cruise passengers are from out of state, 90%. 73% of them spend a day or two or more in New Orleans on either end of their deal. Nearly all of them purchase something while they're in the city of New Orleans, contributing to the tax base. And they also account for 306,000 hotel room nights, and about 32% of them fly in and out of our airport. So it's not just the cruise that does well because the people come, but it really is a benefit to the city. For instance,
It gives the airlines more reasons to have flights to New Orleans.
exactly. Before New Orleans, that number of passengers that's been over a million, or at a million or over for 5 straight years, was only at 734,643. So it has grown by 250,000 almost in that time since Katrina. We are the 6th largest cruise port in the nation. Behind, I was like, well, who are we behind? I'm trying to count them up, and it's three ports in Florida: Port Everglades, Port Canaveral, and Port of Miami, New York, and Galveston. But we are getting newer and larger ships in kind of on a regular basis. In fact, in November, Norwegian Cruise Line's Breakaway home ported its inaugural cruise out of the city of New Orleans. It's the biggest ship in both length and passenger count ever to cruise from the city. It goes on 5, 7, 10, and 11-day cruises to Mexico, Honduras, and Belize. So there are some new offerings out of New Orleans. It's not just Mexico or the Caribbean. And we talked about it on this show a while back, but Disney announced starting in 2020, it will home port a ship just for a short window of time, just February and March in 2020. But its first 4-day cruise out of the city of New Orleans sold out in 1 hour's time.
Wow.
Kind of popular.
And at Errol's urging, I asked the question, will having Disney here hurt the other lines? And it really serves a very different demographic. It shouldn't hurt Carnival or Norwegian or Royal Caribbean. Those are the 4 companies that home port ships here now: 2 Carnival ships, 1 Royal Caribbean, and 1 Norwegian, as well as 5 river cruises, which are really big business too. They're much smaller ships. They don't bring in quite the number of people, but there are 5 of them that are home ported in New Orleans, cruising regularly. So it really is a very big business that continues to grow. The Orado Cruise Terminal was completed in 2006, the Julia in 2012. Disney will be at the Orado Terminal with Carnival.
The other side of the story is, think of those little coastal destinations in Honduras and Mexico, and towns like Progreso in Mexico that are just basically poor towns. Now all of a sudden they have all these big ships coming from New Orleans and from Galveston, and so it's been good activity for them.
Well, and Royal Caribbean's ship that arrived just last weekend, it's the first time Royal Caribbean's had a ship home ported here for 2 years. So
There were a lot of tourists. They're bringing in a lot of tourists and to the city. And so most of the destinations are still Mexico,
Caribbean and Mexico, but with the advent of this huge ship from Norwegian Cruise Lines that's doing up to 11-day cruises, they can go as far as Belize and Honduras. And
It's what they call the Western Caribbean, which isn't the Caribbean of legend. You know, the Caribbean of legend is down in the Antilles and all of this, but they've kind of created the Western Caribbean, which is really the Gulf Coast, as a destination. And then the other thing is, you know, it's going to really explode once Cuba opens up more. Imagine flying to New Orleans, staying a few nights in New Orleans,
And then
going to Cuba, and then coming back. You know, so that'd be.
Be a great experience. All right, thanks a lot, Dawn. Mike, over to you again. St. Tammany Parish now, you know, we've always thought of St. Tammany Parish, you go there and get away from any kind of troubles with politics or corruption. We've learned a little bit differently.
Well, that was the bedroom community, you know, image that it liked to portray, and that actually attracted people who might have been inclined to, you know, leave the urban center of New Orleans or even the close-in suburbs of Jefferson Parish. But we see that, as many people have stated, corruption knows no boundaries, and we have seen that over the past several years in St. Tammany. The move really started, you know, a little more quietly with the Mandeville Mayor Eddie Price. Went down and actually did a 4-year prison term for really penny-ante corruption of, you know, taking perks from people doing business with the city. But that exploded in a much bigger way with parish-wide elected officials, Peter Galvin, the coroner, who out of it almost looked like sheer greed, lining his pockets with pay raises and, you know, self-dealing contracts. That's actually gave rise to sort of a grassroots movement, concerned citizens of Greater St. Tammany who really started keeping an eye on officials, which had been given almost carte blanche from somewhat politically sleepy, voting population, who just entrusted officials to rule, sometimes for decades. In the case of the next official to go down, Walter Reed, the very powerful district attorney, I think he was in office for 36 years, when under the weight of a corruption investigation decided, not to run. He's now since been convicted of, multiple counts of corruption in federal court, currently on appeal, all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. So he remains free while awaiting the resolution of that case. But now we see the third leg of that stool, the parish-wide elected official, former Sheriff Jack Strain. He has yet to be charged or indicted, but his name is everywhere, both with two people who have been charged in a bill of information in federal court, connected to a work release program that Strain launched. Those were two top deputies and childhood cronies of his, accused of giving kickbacks in a very transparent way in the bill of information to Strain. In the course of that, there are allegations of now sexual abuse of teenagers. The details of that still murky, but that has surfaced as this federal investigation has expanded into those areas. So we're obviously keeping a close eye on just when Strain is going to be named in charges, probably in the course of a federal indictment.
And any statements from Strain at all in response to these?
We've reached out to his attorney. He's got a high-profile criminal defense attorney. So far, he's remained in hiding without comment, but that's going to come out probably sooner rather than later.
So, new day for St. Tammany, though.
But it's
citizens really getting a lot more engaged.
Right, and it's opened everybody's eyes that just because in St. Tammany is still an area where you can sort of escape maybe some of the urban ills of a New Orleans, or crowded Veterans Highway in Jefferson Parish, but corruption really is about individuals willing to take a risk and do the wrong thing, and that can happen anywhere. And now we know can and does in St. Tammany.
And that citizen engagement does mean something. It really does.
It means a lot.
Important.
It means a lot.
All righty. Thanks a lot, Mike. Staff, over to you.
Yeah.
David Vitter and his new career.
Yes. So David Vitter left the Senate after he lost the gubernatorial race to John Bel Edwards, and he went to work for a company in Washington, a K Street lobbying firm called Mercury Public Affairs. And this has really plunged him into this new world of, I would say, international intrigue and some kind of interesting characters who I have to think, going back to the David Vitter we all knew back in the 90s when he was Mr. Zero Tolerance, remember, he might not have approved of. But one of his clients was in the news this week. He's a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska. He is an aluminum manufacturer, very wealthy, close to Vladimir Putin. There are allegations that he has ties to the Russian mob. I mean, kind of a figure like that, although he's been trying to gain respectability in the international circuit for a while.
And that's why you need a lobbyist.
And that's why you hire a guy named like David Vitter and Mercury, and some other people, some very big-name British people. What happened this week is that there have been sanctions, American sanctions on his companies, and they were lifted this week by the Treasury Department. There was an agreement that he is stepping aside from some of his companies. I think there's a question of whether he really is, but that's part of the agreement. David Vitter was one of the lobbyists on this case. There was a New York Times story that described his role as kind of corralling other ambassadors to the U.S. to help push to reduce sanctions, saying that it would harm their economies. And something else about this guy is, and this doesn't really involve David Vitter, but just kind of tells you what kind of character he is. He came up in the Paul Manafort case. He's someone who Paul Manafort had a big debt to. They were both involved in the Ukraine. David Vitter, the Mercury is in there too. There are clients from Turkey. There's a client that is a Chinese tech company that Congress has banned the government from doing business with for fear that they are a spy company, basically. There is a quote that Marco Rubio, who's another Republican senator, a former colleague from Florida of David Vitter's, said about Mercury in conjunction with this Chinese case, saying, this is the kind of the go-to lobbying firm for people who are human rights violators, adversaries of the U.S. But on the other hand, I should say this is how it works in this world. Right. I mean, if you are someone who needs influence in the government, maybe you're not always the most upright character.
Yeah, it's not unusual at all for former legislators to move into the world of lobbying.
And so I should add that David Vitter, in becoming a lobbyist, is following in the footsteps of everybody, of John Breaux, of Billy Tozan, of Bennett Johnston, of Bob Livingston, of course, who once represented Libya under Gaddafi. So there have been other instances
the
like
real question
this.
is who
Mary
has
Landrieu.
not gotten
Exactly, yes. That they're the unusual cases.
But it's this association with this Russian oligarch that has sort of raised some eyebrows.
It's interesting. And again, it's interesting when you think of David Vitter's trajectory over the many years, because when he started off, remember, if you were associated with Edwin Edwards, if you were associated with gambling, you were a suspect. And I think he probably has to be a little more tolerant of the people he's around now in this new business.
It would seem. Okay,
Yes.
Steph, thanks a lot. It is time now to look ahead.
Well, there used to be a house on at 4506 Canal Street that between 1946 and 67 was known for its elaborate decorations, called the Centennial House. People would come from miles around to go and see the Centennial House. And they'd stand in line. It was just wonderful. After 67, when Mrs. Centenni died, they stopped doing it. Now the new owners of the house have decorated the house again. Oh, really? It's very nice. There's not the big sand on the plastic elephant like there used to be, but it's very pretty and it's worth seeing. And so anybody who has memories of the Centennial House, or even if you don't, just take a ride past 4607 Canal Street. Take a look.
I have memories of that Centennial House way before celebration.
That's what
of the
influenced Al Copeland as a young man when he saw that
that
house.
did. It
and he
inspired
said,
him.
The
Yeah.
Centennial House is structure.
Steph?
In 2019, we will finally find out whether Mitch Landrieu is running for president. If he does, we found out this week he will be spared at least one indignity that Bobby Jindal suffered, and that is the kids' table debate. The Democrats have announced that they're not going to do that.
Okay, done.
It's now open at the Convention Center. It's Christmas Fest NOLA. It's been here for several years, but you can go ice skating and go on an ice slide in downtown New Orleans.
All
which
righty.
is
Have all kinds of fun. Thanks. Mike.
Keeping in the Christmas theme, we all know about Holiday in the Oaks in City Park, but the light show at La Ferriere, quite large, draws a big crowd, and I was very surprised to find out that the lights that once adorned Al Copeland's house are the same
they were
lights
donated,
that decorate much of La Ferriere Park.
Right, it's a beautiful,
Al
beautiful
Copeland
sight.
lives on.
It was goes back to the
Indeed he
Centennial
does.
House and being
Exactly.
influenced
Right.
by that.
All
There
right,
you
guys,
go.
thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for watching. Have a very, very Merry Christmas. Happy and safe holiday. We'll see you again next week. For Informed Sources, have a good evening.